everybody. Welcome back to the Everyday Night. I'm Joe.
And I'm Jeff.
And Jeff, I was thinking that it would be useful to talk tonight.
God forbid we do something useful.
Something useful. Well, it may happen. A continuation of some of the things we've talked about before in terms of the kinds of society and governments we think make the most sense and are most consistent with the virtues. And
Yes. Yep.
you mentioned the social contract. I've talked about ethical pragmatism. And one of the things I was thinking about is something that I've used in courses I've taught, and it's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Abraham Maslow, who is also credited as saying, if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail.
Yeah, right.
Although it's debatable whether he was the first one to say that or a version of that, but he's often credited with that. He came up with something called a hierarchy of needs.
Right.
And the hierarchy of needs was his.
Most of us learn these in social studies class.
Exactly.
At some point.
And it's a useful model.
It's somewhat theoretical.
Yeah, the research behind it is not there necessarily, and there's a lot of debate about it. But the premise is that the basic levels of need are something that everyone needs, and then you progress beyond those to your personal needs, their emotional, social needs. And I can put this up, model this up to show everybody here, which I will do. And so this is a model.
That's washing me right out. Pops up on my screen.
Sorry.
That's okay.
So this is a model that it has expanded on some of the definitions: physiological needs, safety needs, love and belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. And it's designed as a pyramid because you have to have the base before you can build the next layer, and so on.
Right.
And as I was thinking about this, in light of the virtues and in light of what we've talked about, it occurred to me that profiting from basic physiological needs that every human being has, clean air, clean water, clean food, shelter, a safe place to sleep, some kind of safe society, safe place to sleep, health care, those sorts of things. Profiting from those things beyond a certain basic level, I think violates the social contract, is unethical, and is not a pragmatic way to build a society. My premise is that a healthier society, the reason for a government is so that everybody can collectively provide these things, assure these things to everybody, because that enables people to then build on that and go beyond.
Yes. Okay. So you said a lot of things there.
I did.
I'm going to go back and pick at it a little bit. That I just want to be clear that you said profit beyond a certain level, and I would say profit
up to a certain level. Yes, that's correct.
So yeah, basic healthcare,
yes.
But like elective surgeries and cosmetic surgeries and that sort of thing are a luxury,
right?
So and I agree with you in principle here that I think that it is a society's job, if if we're going to call, or if we're going to embody a society in a government, right?
Right.
And we ostensibly have a representative government. So the government is us, and it is supposed to be doing what we want. But I think there's also something that we are struggling with currently, is that it's not just what the majority wants. What the society should be doing is providing for everybody. Right?
Well, yes.
Or at least trying to create the best environment, health wise, safety wise, for everyone in the society.
Sure. So something like clean air,
right,
benefits everybody.
Yes.
Because everybody, no matter their means, has to breathe.
Right. Right.
So, but importantly, before we continue,
we also have to drink.
Yes. And what, pray tell, are you drinking tonight?
I happen to have, I was gifted a bottle of Macallan 12-year double cask.
Nice.
So yeah, I mean, for a Scotch, it's okay. But it's got a nice caramely flavor and a little smokiness to it. I'm not a Scotch guy, as you know, but this satisfied me, and I managed to give a lot of it away at the place where I was gifted it, and I'm just working on what's left.
Okay, sounds
and
good.
You, sir?
I have let's see if I can. I don't think my name is showing. I got my name on this on the glass. This is a Griffin Claw Brewery, Mr. Blue Sky wheat beer.
I was going to say it looks like a wheat beer.
It is a wheat beer. It's
good for summer.
Yeah, good for summer. So, to your health.
Yours too. Cheers. So I was getting to, I agree with you in that I think a society is best served by providing basic needs. But again, we have to, as a body, as a society, decide that we are all going to contribute to that.
Yes.
And there are certain members in any society who don't believe they should be responsible or be held responsible for their neighbors' well-being.
I had a discussion once with somebody who was a big advocate of personal responsibility. And excuse me. And I've mentioned this before. And my question to them was, well, does that mean you're only responsible for yourself? Yeah. Well, you're married. Do you feel a responsibility to your wife? Well, yeah. Well, you have children. Do you feel a responsibility to them? Yeah. So your personal responsibility extends to your family, to caring for them, providing for their needs, teaching your children, and that sort of thing. Well, yeah. Well, are you friendly with your neighbors? Well, yeah, I like my neighborhood. So do you have a responsibility to your neighborhood? If your neighbor's house was on fire and you had a hose, and would you at least call the fire department? Would you help?
In his model, there wouldn't be a fire department.
Well, I know, but he and so I said, my premise was that personal responsibility does not mean simply looking out for yourself. It means personally taking responsibility for yourself and your family and your friends and your community and your city and your state and your country and humanity. Ultimately, that's personal responsibility. It doesn't mean you're only looking out for yourself. It means you are accepting responsibility personally to do the best you can to, the concept is called healing the world, or tikkun olam, that as was written about it, you're not responsible for healing the entire world yourself, but you're not free to give up the work either.
Right.
You don't have to complete it, but you have to continue it. And that's really where I'm coming from, that personal responsibility as a society, as the government, if the government does truly represent us, we can do more collectively to raise the level
Yes.
For the least fortunate among us, and thereby raise the level of the entire society.
Well, it's an
and we
extension.
can do that collectively.
Yeah. Well, it's an extension of that social contract, right?
Yes.
If we are better off working as a team, we are biologically best suited if we work in packs.
We are
communally.
We're evolved. Humans evolved to be social creatures.
Yes.
And concepts of morality and ethics evolved because the people who had those were best suited to exist and contribute and reproduce in a socially evolved culture.
Right. The alternative to me is, everyone camped on their own tiny agrarian plot, making, with just enough food to survive, and a gun pointed out every window to make sure that your neighbors don't take any of your stuff. It would be a mean and brutal existence.
Nasty, brutish, and short, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
As Hobbes wrote about the Middle Ages.
Right. So, I mean, in that model where you are personally responsible for yourself and nothing else, and no one else is responsible for you, there's no such thing as currency in a model like that.
Yep.
There's a market. The concept of a market can't exist.
Contracts.
Right. At the extremes of that model.
Right. Contracts, because courts are designed to enforce contracts and between people. That's the survivalist model of the lone guy living in the woods by himself is far less successful as a model to emulate than a collaborative, cooperative society of people. Right. Well, because everybody has their strengths and weaknesses.
And you cannot, you and your, let's say you and your wife and however many children you think you need to have to survive would eventually die out.
Yep.
You can't, that is too small a gene pool. We have to cooperate just to survive.
So I come back to the virtue of veritas, honesty.
Right.
Honesty is self-honesty is essential. I mean, you can't be honest with other people. You can't be honest with a group of people unless you're honest with yourself, and then with yourself about yourself. And the people who are the what's the term I heard? Cosplatriots. So cosplay the people who think that the Rambo model isn't fiction, it's a instruction manual, right? They're deluding themselves. And
well, this is built, that the Rambo thing is built on the myth of the Old West also.
Yeah. And it's an entertaining story. But and certainly I'm a fan of old Westerns too.
Well, yeah.
Um,
I mean, the rugged individualist who's, you know, the lone gunman traveling across the desert and righting wrongs and not depending on anyone and saving the town and riding off to his next adventure is certainly an appealing mythos,
right.
but that's what it is.
Yeah, and um I contrast the movie High Noon with the Magnificent Seven, either iteration,
Okay.
either the Yul Brynner Steve McQueen version or the Denzel Washington version, which I like both of them. But in the what was the first one I mentioned?
High Noon.
High Noon, that's right. In High Noon, Gary Cooper is the town sheriff or marshal, I forget which, and bad guys are coming to town, and he asks the townspeople for help, and nobody will do it because they're afraid, and he single-handedly defeats the bad guys and then tosses down his badge and leaves town with Grace Kelly, I think. And
so that was the model of the man who took an oath and swore to do a job,
yes,
despite any adversity. So
right.
he does what a man's got to do, what a man's got to do,
right.
where that quote famously comes from.
Right. And the problem is the townspeople, like the townspeople in either of the iterations of the Magnificent Seven, they needed leadership, they needed guidance, but they pitched in.
Right.
And they did what they needed to defend their town and their friends and their community and their families.
Right.
They had the leadership of these experts, but they did what was needed to be done, and it was stronger, it was more effective. And I think goodness knows I'm a fan of Gary Cooper, but I think I've read a review of High Noon where it said they were amateurs, he did better off without them. It's like, no, are you kidding? You don't know anything.
Yeah, right.
To say he would have been far better off if he had people watching his back and watching the alerting and doing all the other things, support stuff. I think that mythos, the Die Hard movies are an example of that mythos brought into a modern era, particularly the first one.
Well, there's lots, and I mean, there's
yeah,
hundreds of the one guy against incredible odds story. I mean, that's just a trope that,
yeah, and it's
so much a trope you don't even recognize it as a trope anymore.
Right. And it's admirable, and it makes for entertaining stories, but it's not a model for society's survival.
Right. Right.
And so we go back to Maslow, and let me find the model here to share again.
While you're looking for that, I like to contrast High Noon with High Plains Drifter.
Oh yeah,
which is like the opposite.
Yes,
where the sheriff is abandoned by the town, and you don't find this is revealed later in the movie, spoiler if you've never seen it. The sheriff is abandoned by the town and is killed by these bad guys, and then later on comes back, and we're not sure if he's a ghost or if he was left for dead or what. There's a body on the hill that is supposed to be the sheriff. But he comes back and he takes vengeance on the town and the people and the guys specifically that killed him.
Yeah.
So it's the exact opposite of High Noon.
And again, the stories are entertaining, not a model for society. It's
Right.
and the worst, some ways, the worst kind of violation of veritas as a virtue is self-deception.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah, we've discussed that at length.
yes, I think also it takes courage, another virtue, to admit where your weaknesses are, and therefore to say, I can do this thing, but you can do this. Let's team up. Let's work together. And yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot about courage in the absence of courage and mob courage lately.
Yeah,
The
maybe
courage that people,
that's for another episode.
that's for another episode. So when we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs here,
Right.
Clean air. Sure.
Right.
There are people who oppose regulation of pollution,
And
of the air and of the water, because the less regulation means the more they can pollute, which means they don't have to incur the business costs of being clean. And in fact, one of the problems is when profit is personalized, but costs and risks are spread across society, or socialized. And so if a company, for example, pollutes the air and then isn't responsible for cleaning it up, who has to clean, or the water, who has to clean it up? Taxpayers do. People have to.
Right.
So physiological needs, food. Now, beyond, when I talk about water, I'm not talking about bottled water. If you want to buy Fiji water that's supposedly imported from Fiji, great, do it. But tap water,
clean, safe water,
safe water, should be something. Clean, safe water, clean, safe air is something that should be guaranteed by society. And by society, I mean a responsible government.
Well, the whole bottled water thing is a result of deregulation, or at least a refusal to invest in infrastructure, right? I mean, the whole bottled water thing was built on, well, and the water coming out of your tap isn't clean. I mean, those pipes are ancient, and some of them were lead, and that's how it was sold to people.
Yeah, except in bottled water, in a lot of places, a lot of bottled water is tap water.
Yep. Yeah, it sure is.
So again, I blame marketing for that,
Yeah.
And greed.
Yeah.
Now food, beyond everybody needs food to survive, and the government does support people with things like food stamps and aid to children and pregnant women with food. And it's debatable whether or not the regulations governing that are appropriate, and the rules governing that and what's available. And it's debatable whether or not people actually who need it get access. I would also argue that food education in public school is essential. And
well, I remember having a nutrition section in my science.
My health class was taught by a gym teacher who didn't know shit.
Well, yeah. Well, but see, we can talk about education as a whole other thing.
Yes. I have a lot of thoughts, as you might imagine.
Yeah. Well,
about
so
education.
Yeah. So yeah, food, some sort of basic sustenance is necessary to everyone.
Right. So as is shelter. And one of the things that I'll share this other other thing here that I've got, and this is a model of the housing first idea or program. And so there's a model in addressing homelessness. The typical model, existing model that has really failed, is homeless people in temporary shelters, and then they might be able to access some care, or they're out on the street or not, or there's a transitional home, or just lots of failure points. Doesn't work. The housing first model turns that on its head, where somebody who's homeless doesn't have to prove that they're medically and behaviorally and mentally stable first before they can get shelter. There's certainly some kind of entry requirements, but it's basically the solution to somebody who's homeless is to give them a housing. And then as a condition of that, or as part of that, they get medical, behavioral, mental counseling, income support, and so on. And the housing becomes theirs, and they can build on that. And it's not only more cost effective, way more cost effective, it's more effective where it's been done. And yet there's resistance to it, just as there is resistance to the idea of people getting some kind of food support, and certainly the idea of a guaranteed basic income, which is something that's been discussed, given that a lot of so-called entry-level jobs that aren't done just by people entering in the workforce, but low-wage jobs are being replaced by automation.
True.
In food preparation and service and self-ordering and other things. But
No.
Who's opposed to these things? And I think there's a religious, puritanical opposition to doing these sorts of things.
Well, it's a kind of a twisted Christianity that's bound up in that self-reliance that we were talking about earlier. But the model that you just had up there, I think maybe a little oversimplistic.
Well, it's a simple graphic.
Yeah,
it is a simple graphic. The actual administration of a housing first program is much more complex than that graphic shows.
Right.
But without quoting the statistics, which I could do, where it has been tried, it's been proven to cost less and be more successful.
Now, I remember, and maybe it was a simply a poor administration, but I remember how back in the 60s and 70s, the projects that happened all around the country, those kind of failed.
They did.
But that was the object, was to give people housing, not give, but provide extremely low income housing.
Yes.
In an efficient way, in a cost-effective way. I think the failure was that there was no way to climb out of it.
Yes.
That there was no support beyond the housing as far as getting a job and being able to move up and move out.
Exactly. So there was no individual counseling in terms of employment and medical and mental health and behavioral support and so on. There was none of that. It was more like warehousing, and the design of the projects was also problematic because it didn't allow for a sense of individual ownership either, which the housing first efforts usually do. They're usually
This is the
individual units.
this is the Habitat for Humanity
Right, this sort
model.
of thing, similar
Yeah.
to, yeah.
Okay.
So, but if somebody's poor, it's their own fault sort of idea. The flip side of which is the so-called prosperity gospel that
Right.
which leads to the mega churches with preachers with several $1 million, multi-million-dollar houses and jets and yachts and that
Right.
sort of thing. That's all of a part, and that's all of a piece of that.
Yeah.
That if somebody's poor, well, then they're obviously somehow deficient, morally deficient. Viewing
Right.
poverty as a moral issue.
Right. And if you're rich, you must be favored of God.
Yes.
And the extension, that's where the prosperity gospel comes from, is the flipping of that from someone who's prosperous is favored by God. Well, if you're favored by God, then you will all that follows then that you will be prosperous.
Right.
It's a weird, weird, but insidiously attractive.
It's
doctrine.
Michigas. It's Michigas.
Yeah. Well, of course it is.
I did have to ask someone to clarify the difference between Michigas and Narishkeit.
Oh, well, I have struggled with those two.
Yeah,
Being able to tell the difference. Yeah, me too.
Yeah. And yeah.
So what did you get?
That Michigas is more like silliness and Narishkeit is like craziness. Or maybe it's the other way around. Now I'm confused again. More on this, I'll report back to you all.
And our Yiddish correspondent will get back to us.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So, talking about that, looking at that pyramid again, we discussed it briefly before we started recording, but I think that ideally what we're looking for is a society or a government that is representative of a society or community,
right.
is tasked with supplying the bottom two things, right? That's what we want.
I think so. I think that it's debatable in this model what resources refers to.
Yeah.
And safety needs. And it's debatable what employment needs, but some kind of basic employment. I mean, the government has tried to do that, say in the
New Deal.
The New Deal. Work for welfare is a more recent concept of that didn't work very well. But the New Deal was, everybody, a job for everybody. And because and a lot of people have said it, that the best help you can give somebody is a regular paycheck. So, and given how much as a society we need to do, there should be plenty of work for everybody. And not only everybody, we've got more work than can be done by the people who live here. Immigration has always been a means to increase the workforce and the society to the benefit of the entire society. But in our current situation, we are importing labor because we can get labor cheaper outside this country. Yes. And so it's putting people out of work in this country. Yes. And people mistakenly blame those other countries, not the corporations that are actually hiring those people instead of you. Yes. And people blame the government for inflation or like gas prices, when gas companies are making record profits. Oil companies are making record profits. Right. People are so disconnected from the understanding of corporations and profits.
If you want to blame the government, you have to go all the way back to where government deregulated not just the companies themselves, but completely dismantled. Well, not completely. You see a sort of skeletal, wizened version of the antitrust laws that were put in place in the 90s, 1890s.
Yes. In a lot of ways, we're back to the, well, and it's interesting because just about every 80 years in the United States, since the founding of the United States, there's been a depression. And coming out of that depression, the government has established regulations to laws and regulations to prevent the sort of thing from happening again.
Right. And, gradually
and then over the course of 80 years, those laws and regulations are dismantled as people forget what it was like. And then there's another crash.
Right. Right.
So, right. So you look at what would the crash of 2008, 80 years before that was 1928, 29 crash, right? And you look at 80 years before that was the 20 years before
1850s.
Yeah. So
the 1850s, however, though, that crash was mitigated somewhat by the opening of the West. So and the crash in the 20s and 30s was mitigated by World War II. And, but that's kind of thing, something happens. Right. And sometimes that thing that happens isn't good.
Right. And yet still regulations, the regulations that required standard commercial banks, like where you have a checking account, write checks and get that sort of thing, from investment banks, separated those two so that your local bank where you write your checks can't play roulette with your savings and your money. That broke down, and banks, that separation was eliminated, and banks started investing in derivatives and all sorts of stuff. And I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons and a whole bunch of things. Every disaster requires multiple things to go wrong, not just one thing.
Right.
So anyway, to get back to this, you said something about before we were talking about the first two levels, to some degree, are things that societies, as represented by their governments and the people working together, should be a level of things that are guaranteed to the
system. It's at least, I think, the responsibility of a collective representative government. So we empower a government to provide those things for us as a society.
Right.
That's a government exists for those reasons, to do those things.
And the next two levels, love and belonging and esteem, you said are things that
we as citizens are asked to provide for each other.
Yeah.
Right. Respect, friendship, intimacy, sense of connection. Those are the things that we, to greater or lesser extent, as individual, proclivities allow, those are the things that the society, or that we as members of the society are to provide. But we can't expect the government to provide any of those things for us. But to be a functioning society, we have to share and provide those things for ourselves. That if a good citizen gives those things back to his community.
Franchise.
Franchise, exactly.
Yeah.
So I see those two things as something that the government, if we can task the government to do these things and they are doing them properly, we are now responsible collectively to provide these other things ourselves, amongst ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then the very tippy top, the self-actualization, that is all you, that is all internal.
Right. And the one of the things that's argued about, and people argue about this, is whether or not each level has to be met before you can progress to the next level and self-actualization. I think a bunch of things can happen at the same time, but you're certainly not going to, you're not necessarily going to worry about self-esteem if you don't know, or think about self-esteem if you're hungry.
Right. That has to take your pride has to take second place to whether you can feed yourself.
Right. So I mean, I agree with your analysis of it. This is the society, this is we as the society, the government as tasked by us.
Yeah. Right.
All of us together as community. So you might say society, community, and then the individual.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, I like that. And I think in a lot of ways, I mean, I mentioned several of the virtues. I think it relates because it goes beyond just, we mentioned before that the virtues are not simply attributes, they're actions. They have to be put into action. One is not simply honest sitting by yourself, unless you're talking only about self-honesty.
Right.
One is not simply truthful, and you can lie to yourself, but
yeah, and you can't be generous. You can't be generous if there's no one to be generous to.
Right. And so on. So it occurred to me that using Maslow's hierarchy, which is very familiar to a lot of people, would be an interesting way to talk about the virtues as they extend into a larger societal context. And I think that's what we've done.
Okay. I don't think we could go much deeper, I think, into this and differences in how different governments can accomplish those bottom two in different ways.
Certainly. And how people can seek self-esteem and respect and earn respect and lose respect. And also, what's the cutoff? So clean air, clean water, that's great public resources, but what about food? I mean, how much food and what kind of food and so on? And that's something that's debated a lot. And we talked about housing a little bit, but healthcare, for example, is interesting because even in the say Medicare for all or healthcare for all models, there are lots of different versions of that.
Yeah.
Some countries, there's a basic level of care. And then if you say you can, if you have the means, buy more than that.
Right.
In your healthcare coverage. If you want a private room in a hospital, if you want certain things beyond, regular doctor visits, dental visits, eye exams, that sort of thing. So we could certainly debate a lot about that. That's getting into very specific policies And
Right.
I think what I was after with this was talking about general principle.
Well, and I wasn't talking about how do we specifically solve the housing problem, or how do we
Right,
specifically
right,
solve Medicare for all. I was talking about the differences between how, say, a communist government handles, how does it provide these things, and how does a capitalist government provide these things, and neither of them do it very well
right.
in their pure
Well,
form.
and neither capitalism nor communism are, they're economic systems, they're not governmental
True.
systems.
True.
And the United States has never been a purely capitalist society. It's always been a blended form
Yeah.
of the economy with some levels of governmental support for some services to people. And but I think an unregulated laissez-faire capitalism is survival of the, well, that's a misappropriation of the term survival of the fittest. That didn't mean fittest as in strongest, it meant most fit to their environment,
Yeah.
best fitted to their environment. But survival of the might makes right in a lot of ways. And a libertarian system is just an extension of that. That's government by Rambo sort of thing,
And that's what I was
Ayn
talking
Rand
about.
sort of thing. Yeah,
That's what I was talking about. The libertarian system is the lone guy with the barbed wire around his property, with a garden big enough to feed him and his family, and stay off my property because the only reason you're here is to take my stuff.
right. And I think libertarianism and communism are both fantasies that don't understand anything about human nature. And they're both easily corrupted. And there's no example of a successful.
It's hard to, I think, corrupt a libertarian system, but you're already living your meanest, dirtiest, hardest life. What?
Well, if you look at Somalia, where there's just warlords,
Yeah,
and piracy, that's libertarianism. That's the logical extension of libertarianism.
well,
And it's not everybody as an individual, it's they group together.
Well, but see, if you're warlords, now we're talking about feudalism.
Exactly.
Technically it's a modern feudal society. If you have no central government and you are regionally divided amongst warlord territories, that is what feudalism is.
And that's what libertarianism eventually leads to.
Right. Well, that's
feudalism.
To me, it's libertarianism and anarchy are hand-holding cousins.
Yeah, exactly. And communism there's never been a successful communist government. One of the things that, because they're always corrupted, and one of the things that just pisses me off is people who don't understand the differences between these systems, and someone who will denounce socialist, communist, whatever, in the same breath, and not understand the differences between those, and the difference between that and a social democracy, or understand the evils of capitalism that are unregulated capitalism, and so on. Because education, right?
Well,
which is one of those things.
Keep going back to that.
The idea that taxpayer funds can be pulled out of, essentially that's what's happening, out of the public school system and given to private schools, private religious schools,
yeah,
is really objectionable. That's one of those things. No, there's a level of education. It shouldn't be based on property taxes because that's perpetuating an inherently unequal
Right.
form of quality of education. But
But you
then
can't get that past anybody. You
right,
can't convince a parent that their taxes shouldn't go to their kid.
right. But I don't have kids, and I want there to be schools because I want to live in an educated society.
And
And I don't want
and
my
you're
tax,
required to pay those taxes where you
yeah,
live, regardless whether you have kids or not.
right. And I
Yeah.
don't want my support to go to religious indoctrination.
Exactly right.
So I think that's profoundly unfair. I think that would be a level above where you're willing to pay for that beyond the cost, beyond public school, which is a shared cost, which is in that first couple of levels of Maslow's hierarchy.
Agreed.
Okay. Well, that's taken care of then.
Right. Now, if all of our so-called leaders would just listen to what we've got to say.
Right.
The problem I wanted to touch briefly on people's knee-jerk fear of communism and socialism. I think that what people fear about communism is not communism itself. Communism is, I mean, there were communes in the 60s that it's just about sharing resources and living together under a certain set of rules that everyone agrees to. That's all communism is. But it doesn't scale up very well.
No.
And the problem is that, and this is my theory, is that I believe the communism doesn't work because it is counter to human nature. Human nature, it is human nature to want to improve your lot. You want to have a more comfortable home. You want to have better food. You want to have more leisure time. You want to, everyone wants to improve their lot for themselves and for their progeny. Communism doesn't recognize that. It says everyone gets the same thing and therefore requires an authoritarian government to enforce that equality.
Right. Except that the people in charge always had more.
And that's where the corruption comes in.
Right.
Yeah. Members of the party.
Right.
Because they are succumbing to their human nature and improving their lot on the backs of all of their comrades, so to speak. So yeah, but I think that's why people are so afraid of communism, because the models we have seen so far are authoritarian dictatorships.
Yes.
That impoverish the people.
Communist authoritarian, again, communism is an economic model.
Yes.
Authoritarianism is a government model.
I agree.
And it's possible to have an authoritarian capitalist, authoritarian government capitalist economic system, as was recently tried.
That's what Russia is now.
Yeah.
I mean,
essentially
we're talking about an oligarchy, which is kind of the same, similar thing, an authoritarian capitalist system. So Russia went from one scary form of government and economy to another.
Yeah. And it's important to distinguish between the form of government and the form of economy, because they can all coexist. So, okay.
I don't know if we solved any problems. We've decided that as almost always we agree on,
and that the virtues, we keep applying it to situations, but it is the reason that we picked this as the overriding subject and premise for our discussions. Because they apply.
You can always apply them.
And that's the problem. I said I recall I've had several conversations where I have questioned somebody about their thoughts, choices, decisions, policies based on the virtues, and they completely didn't understand what I was talking about.
And I found one of the things I've been struggling with lately is with people I know, people I have respected and called friends, and how in small matters, in personal matters, I would trust them to follow a virtuous model. Somehow it doesn't scale for them to the entire society, to our entire society. And this is my struggle, is like, look, I know you're a good person, but you are backing these people who are blatantly trying to undermine our country, our system of living. And you claim that said, no, the other side is who's attacking our way of life. Then the way of life you are envisioning is not the one that I want to live under.
Right.
And this is my struggle with a lot of people that I know, a lot of people that I've called friends.
Yeah, I some of the same people, undoubtedly.
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure.
And one of the things that I've been thinking about and certainly seen, and I think will be one of the things we talk about with regards to the January 6th committee and the stuff that they've uncovered and the stuff they're continuing to uncover, is the people whose cognitive who people will do almost anything to avoid recognizing that they've been duped, to experience cognitive dissonance, the conflict between what they believe and what they are actually experiencing and seeing.
Right. Yeah.
And people will go to great lengths to deceive themselves, again violating the virtue of self-honesty, when they have already convinced themselves or allowed themselves to be convinced that this is correct when it's actually not, and it's demonstrably not. And I've said
the harder thing for me, really, when it comes to sort of our modern politics, isn't that you've decided this thing is true, but it's not, that this other thing is true. What the harder thing for me is, you think this thing is true because this person told it to you. When you find out that that person has been lying the entire time and serving themselves, why can't you question the thing they told you?
Right.
Why don't you?
It's very frustrating, but it's an established principle of human behavior that people tend to believe the first thing they hear and then forget where they heard it from, and even when presented with contrary information, continue to believe the first thing they hear. And again, comes back to education. One of the reasons why that's important, and one of the reasons I've told my students to question everything, including me, everything, because you have to approach the world with that sort of mind of, is this true? How can it be proven? What about this contrary information? What if information changes? And you have to keep reevaluating that. And that is contrary to a lot of religions that say,
yeah.
don't question, simply obey, simply believe. Here's the unerring truth. Here's what it is. Here's what it's always been, despite the fact that it hasn't always been that way. And this is what you need to believe. People who want to be told rather than figure it out for themselves. So it's extremely frustrating. It's like, well, no, this person was lying to you. Well, yeah, that's irrelevant. This thing is true. I had a student who I was talking about this very subject and mentioned something about young Earth and
Okay.
and despite evidence to the contrary and so on. And the student said, well, her family doesn't believe in dinosaurs. I said, they think the Earth is in. I said, well, do they think, what do they think? Do they think that the evidence was planted as a deception to them? And because I remember took that from a conversation Carl Sagan had once, where he said to someone who is saying, all the evidence, God gave us the intellect to analyze evidence, and all the evidence that we see, you claim that has been put there to challenge our faith as a deception. He said, you, sir, believe in a dishonest God, and I don't. I believe in an honest God. And it was, so I thought about that. She said, yeah, I don't know why they think that. And then she said, but I don't think we landed on the moon.
Yeah, you shared that.
And I didn't want to turn the class into a debate about whether we landed on the moon or not. I said, would it make a difference to you if I presented to you all the evidence that shows that the moon landing could not have been faked, the films could not have been faked, with the technology that existed in 1969, and that the transmissions were picked up all around the world, all the evidence that shows that this really happened, would that make a difference to you? She said, no. I said, then we have nothing to discuss. And so I said to the rest of the class, I said, when you're having a discussion with someone, you first have to establish several rules for discussion.
Are we talking about reality?
Well, you will stick to the facts. You'll present evidence. You will be courteous. You'll be respectful. You won't raise your voice. There's no ad hominem attacks, and so on. No straw man, no logical fallacies. And you have to establish these rules. But the first one is to common terms and definitions. And if you cannot agree on what the facts are and your terms and definitions, you have no basis for discussion. I encountered someone online and I said, well, actually what you're saying is refuted by these sources. Here are several peer-reviewed articles from peer-reviewed journals that show exactly the opposite. And they came back with, oh, peer-reviewed journals are the worst. You can't trust those. I said, well, then we have no basis for discussion.
That's someone who doesn't even understand the nature of peer review.
Right. So there we go.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that science is always perfect. It evolves. It evolves. It grows. People grow in understanding. Like the images from the Webb telescope.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing.
It is. It's absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And it's we have learned more because we developed, by using what we've learned somewhere else, we were able to push knowledge further in this direction. Exactly. And that is how it works. And it's always, when someone says, we talked about this, we're talking about education, what a theory is. In a scientific theory, it's called a theory because there's no actual way to prove that in an infinite universe that this is always the perfect model, but it's the one model we have that fits all the current evidence.
Right.
So we can't, there are some things we call laws of physics, for instance.
Yeah.
And they can be proven to somebody with more mathematical knowledge than I have, but the idea that usually the laws of physics are simply referring to mathematical constants,
right,
that we've observed. That's it. Gravity is a theory.
Well, and the idea of what gravity is changed. Einstein changed that from attraction of mass to a distortion of this space-time continuum,
right?
Because of mass. And
mass is still part of the equation, but
yeah, but so yeah.
So in this case, in the case of gravity, it is a better understanding, but doesn't change how we treat it.
Right.
We understand it better, but the equations haven't really changed when you're talking about how gravity works.
Right. Right. So and gravity doesn't matter if you believe in it or not. You'll still, if I kick you in the head, you'll still fall to the ground. I mean, that's one way I've heard it put, but not that I'm advocating kicking somebody in the head who doesn't deserve it.
No, of course not. Only if they deserve it.
Exactly.
That reminds me of a little story from, let's wander completely off the subject for a moment, to Star Trek episode.
I think we already have, but
we have, but this is all good stuff. The episode of Star Trek, the original series, where Kirk is on trial for killing a crewman because he reacted according to there's all this tapes and all this stuff, and Spock is testifying, and Spock likens Kirk to a force of nature, and he says that, do you know that Kirk, did you see him do this thing? And Spock says, I didn't have to see him. I know he did. Well, how can you know if you didn't see him? I don't have, if I drop a hammer on a planet with positive gravity, I don't have to see it to know that it hits the ground. But the qualifier there was interesting. If I drop a hammer on a planet with positive gravity.
Right. Right. I don't think there can be a planet with negative gravity, but there can be a planet with gravity that is insufficient to.
Well, every mass has positive gravity.
Then it wouldn't, but everything, no matter how small it is, but it might not have gravity sufficient to cause the hammer to overcome any atmospheric resistance, but then a planet without sufficient gravity
wouldn't have an
atmosphere. Do that wouldn't have atmosphere. So,
but he posits that there may be somewhere in the universe a planet with less than positive gravity, with zero or negative gravity.
Well, and there could have been some sort of repulsive, and it could be that hammer, and he didn't specify the kind of hammer, but let's say a regular claw hammer with a ferrous metal head. It could be that he drops the hammer in a place where it still has positive gravity, but there is some sort of magnetic resistance to that, and so it repels the.
Wow, you nerded out on me there, Joe.
I sure did.
Okay.
Sure did.
Then I think that is a sufficient silliness that we can end this thing.
I think so.
And I think we can talk about your courage and cowardice thing in an upcoming episode. I think that's
so.
Important.
Yeah.
As you say, as these hearings become more and more horrifying.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll save that for the next time.
Okay.
Okay. So until then, everybody, thank you. Please like, subscribe, and share,
and
and
all that.
send us your suggestions for what you'd like to hear us talk about.
Yeah, we've not really gotten any suggestions. First person who sent a suggestion that we like may get something. We don't know what. Maybe I don't know what. What would you like?
Yeah, and we're also considering a live Ask Me Anything episode. So
Yes.
If you're interested in that, we'll publicize that so you can tune in and ask us anything. I may not answer everything, but you can ask us anything.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. That's your right.
Yeah.
Okay. Then
Okay.
until we do that, be thou
A good night
and true.